think you're gonna expect an aggressive defensive front. Of course, now he had an even man front mostly in Carolina. The Raiders are probably gonna run a mostly odd man front. But when you look at Derek Brown, Brian Burns, Hassan Reddick, who just signed a big deal in Philadelphia, those guys were proactive and they were aggressive up front. 11 sacks, I believe, for Hassan Reddick, 9, I believe, for Brian Burns, and he was a Pro Bowler. So if you look at those numbers, you gotta like what he can translate over to the Raiders defensive line. Now, the Raiders have a young defensive line, of course. Quentin Jefferson out, Solomon Thomas out. Darius Farland, I believe, is still a free agent. The Raiders hosted him for a visit, but didn't sign him. Of course, he tore his patella tennis. That may be part of it, but new defensive line. Again, young outside of Johnathan Hankins, who I believe may split snaps with Neil Ferrell Jr., who's a fourth-round pick in this year's draft. But Matthew Butler and also, as I just mentioned, Ferrell, I think those two guys are going to have to provide the depth along the line. Of course, Bilal Nichols, I believe he's getting $7 to $8 million guaranteed. He's going to be, I believe, the linchpin that's going to have to be on the field for all three downs. I think he gets about 70% of the snaps. I think he was an underrated player in Chicago, could pretty much grow on that Las Vegas Raiders defensive line.
Yeah, and we look at that front. We talked about the stats. They rushed the quarterback well, but they gave up a lot of points. Was that a situation where Frank Oakham and that team and Patrick Graham now with the defensive scheme that they're going to pressure the quarterback? So that's, of course, going to put more pressure on that young, as you mentioned, defensive backfield. Is that what we saw a little bit in Carolina with that kind of the points per game number kind of jumping up a little bit?
You also have to look at Carolina's offense. Remember, football is a complementary game. So if your offense is not moving the ball well, you're putting your defense in bad situations. Just doing the research, the Panthers, I believe, were top 3 in worst field positioning. I believe they had the worst field positioning of any defense. They start at their own 33-yard line. So you're thinking about it. You're giving the offense a short field to go through, and that's a lot of pressure on your defense. By the way, the Giants were also in the top 3. We'll talk about a little bit later in his defense. But again, if your offense is not moving the ball, puts a lot of pressure on your defense.
Yeah, no doubt about it. All right, let's shift to the players at the positions, and let's start with the edge. Of course, everybody's focused on Maxx Crosby, Chandler Jones, but you have Clelin Ferrell still there in probably the last throws if he doesn't come through, which we don't know yet. And they talked about moving him back outside a little bit as well. And you talked about as well, Matthew Butler and some of the other folks there. What do you expect out of this edge group and Maxx Crosby, Chandler Jones? Chandler Jones, still a great player. I know people are excited about him, but is there any reservation there? What does he need to do better than what we saw last year in order to be as dominant on the other side as Maxx Crosby is on his side?
I think as long as Chandler Jones stays healthy, he'll be fine. Maybe he's not the dominant player he was 4 or 5 years ago. Now, just keep in mind, I believe he had 10.5 sacks last year. Just keep in mind, he had 5 in one game, I believe, against the Tennessee Titans. He tore up Taylor Lewan in that game, and Lewan pretty much said, this guy basically dominated me in the trenches. So half his sacks came in that one game. So could be a little misleading when you look at the sack numbers, but still a pretty solid player on the outside. I think he'll be a better run defender than Yannick Ngakoue was edge. So you get an upgrade in that sense. Now with Maxx Crosby demanding some double teams, I believe Chandler Jones will get some one-on-one matchups. And he did say, I believe he was on a show 2 weeks ago. He said, you can't double team both of us. And if you double team one guy, I think the other guy can win his matchup. And also on the inside, if they're double teaming on the outside, your interior guys, Bilal Nichols, Matthew Butler, if he starts, Johnathan Hankins, I know he's not much of a pass rusher, but those guys have to be able to push the pocket as well if they're ganging up on the guys on the outside.
Mo, at times under the Gruden coaching staff, we heard last year too about Malcolm Koontz, a lot of good things about him. What do you want to see from him to play into that rotation and to be a player that perhaps can at least contribute? I don't think he's going to be a dominant player in the NFL based on what I've seen. What's your thoughts on Malcolm Koontz?
Natural progression from him. I believe he had back-to-back sacks last year, one against Washington Commanders and against Kansas City Chiefs. Then you didn't hear too much about him, but he had some flashes. So he's going to be out there probably as a situational pass rusher, because I believe Kyler Fackrell is going to be the third best edge rusher on that defense. He played 2 years, I believe, under Patrick Graham, played under him in Green Bay. He had 10.5 sacks 1 year, then reunited with Patrick Graham in New York. I believe he had 3-4 sacks there, but he knows the system, so he's going to be an immediate plug-and-play player. Koontz would be I believe the fourth guy on that edge rusher list. Clelin Ferrell, as you mentioned, would probably mix between the edge on the inside. So I wouldn't say he's a pure edge rusher. I wouldn't say he's a pure interior defensive lineman, but he's going to be moving back and forth, so he'll be fluid. But the guy I would keep an eye on, Kyler Fackrell, is the name I would watch.
There you go. You have it from Nostradamus. Let's go on the inside now. One of the guys that I know we've talked about and you've mentioned quite a bit, not only here on Silver and Black today, but also in your pieces up on Bleacher Report and Sports Not, which is Bilal Nichols, from who they signed from the Bears, a guy inside, which I think the coaching staff seems to be pretty excited about what he could do. What did we learn about him in Chicago, and why do we think he could take the next step and be that guy in the middle that the Raiders need him to be?
Hate to use this cliche, but he's got an endless motor. He's going to get you the effort sacks. He's not going to give up on the play. He's going to chase a running back 10, 12, 15 yards down the field. He's not exact. I know I made a point to say that Patrick Graham was going to add about 300 pounds to the defensive line. I believe Bilal Nichols is a shade under. I believe he's in the 290s. So he's a very athletic big guy. So he can get after it against the run and against the pass. Again, I think at his young age, in his mid-20s, he'll be able to blossom into a 60 to 70% defensive snap player. And I look out for him to take a big step with the Raiders.
And what is it about Matthew Butler coming out of Tennessee? This kid looks really strong, and I've watched the film. Looks really good, and I think they got a nice pick there on paper. But what is it about his game and fitting in that scheme, fitting in that group that we talked about? Johnathan Hankins, the veteran, like you said, not a big pass rusher, but does a nice yeoman's job in the middle. What is it about Matthew Butler that should excite Raider fans?
First of all, I think Matthew Butler is actually going to be the star in that defensive line. I've been saying that, for weeks now. I think he's actually going to start over Vernon Butler, the veteran who hasn't really done much over the last 2 years with the Bills. I believe he had 6 sacks in 2019, but it's been quiet since then. Matthew Butler is the guy coming out of Tennessee, played in the very front out there in Tennessee, so he's used to sub packages, and base, and coming out nickel, and just being aware of what he has to do, his role, his job in certain packages. I think he fits in very well with that defensive line philosophy with under Patrick Graham, to be an immediate contributor. He did show some pass rushing prowess in his last year at Tennessee. I believe he had 5 sacks and 8.5 tackles for loss. So you did see that part of his game. And if he blossoms in that aspect, he's going to be a playmaker on that front line.
Well, here's the question, Mo. I mean, you have these pieces that they've brought in. They obviously had churn. You talked about who's gone and we've talked about now who's come in. Looking at, and paper's paper, right? You got to get it done on the field. But looking at what they've done on that defensive line in this offseason, do they have the talent to get that push in the middle that they've lacked really for 4 or 5 years? They've had moments where we saw some of these guys come in and do some good things, but they've also had some big misses. Again, former coaching staff, different regime. But what is it about this unit that gives you hope that they can get it done?
I believe the flashes were there last year between Neil Ferrell Jr. and Matthew Butler. I think you should be excited about both guys coming out of college. Basically, I wouldn't say after their best year for Ferrell. I mean, maybe his next to last year, his penultimate year, was the best year for him at LSU. But I'm really excited about Matthew Butler and Bilal Nichols being the bookends on a interior defensive line, because I think both guys can get after the quarterback and stop the run. And then you have Johnathan Hankins, who we know is a pretty solid run stuffer. Ferrell is going to be his guy, is going to be his eventual replacement probably next year. I would say the end of this year, possibly. I actually had Hankins on a bit of a hot seat. Hankins didn't practice during the spring, and I think that's because he's a veteran, so he doesn't really need to show much in those workouts. But if Ferrell shows something during the spring, I think he's the guy that can take over the starting position over Hankins eventually. They didn't sign Hankins to a huge deal. I don't think he's making $2.5 million on his 1-year re-sign deal. Mm-hmm. So if Ferrell shows something at camp, he can actually take over that position to start. So there's a lot of youth there, so there's a lot to be excited about as far as upside.
Yeah, and before and I agree, Mo, and I think it's a situation where I think they upgraded significantly in my view, especially, but it's kind of a sneaky upgrade, right? It's not big names. You didn't go out and sign some of these guys that fans might have wanted to see on the transaction sheet, but they've gotten better, and I think they've gotten quicker too, right? Which is important, especially in the AFC West. And I know we're not going to do a separate position breakdown, but before we head to the break, linebacker. Let's talk a little bit about linebacker. You did your 53-man projected roster, your early one. before camp up on sportsnot.com. If you haven't read it, I suggest you go do that. Talk about that linebacker position, which has been kind of a black hole. Of course, we know the Corey Littleton, a very expensive experiment, did not work. How's that shaping up, and how's that going to fit into that Graham system, which is different than what Raider fans are used to seeing?
Before I dig into linebacker, I just want to put a bow on defensive line. I think defensive line coach Frank Okam is going to be similar to Brenton Buckner. You're going to look at those two guys similar. Both former players, both played the position. So a lot is going to boil down to coaching, and I feel good about Frank Okam. But as far as linebackers are concerned, I had some surprises in my 53-man depth chart. I had Darian Butler making it the undrafted rookie out of Arizona State. I believe Antonio Pierce, who's the linebackers coach with the Raiders and was the defensive coordinator and co-defensive coordinator at Arizona State, can get the best out of him. I believe Jayon Brown and Denzel Perryman, who just had a Pro Bowl year, are going to be your two main linebackers. Now, people are going to say, well, what about Devon Diablo? And I will say Devon Diablo did play well at the end of last year when they decided to bench Corey Littleton. But when it comes down to experience, I believe Jayon Brown has about 6 years of experience, and he was a pretty solid starting linebacker for the most part with the Tennessee Titans. I think he edges Devon Diablo. But the three of them will play in a rotation between Perryman, Diablo, and Brown. They'll all get significant snaps, but the two main guys, Perryman and Jayon Brown, the two guys I think are going to get the most snaps at linebacker. Then Devon Diablo will fill in some gaps and spell for both guys.
Yeah, no, it's good. Yeah, the that's one thing too, and not to put dispersions on anyone else, but I look at each of the position coaches on this staff, and to me, significant upgrades, not only based on their history, but their personality. When you read the bios, when you see where they've been, what they've done. And Josh McDaniel's been very good about putting these guys out there to talk to the media too. So you get a sense for kind of who they are and their philosophy. And that's important because the media can ask. I know a lot of you think the media asks stupid questions all the time, but we actually ask some good ones occasionally. And I think in this case with these position coaches, you saw that happen really in overdrive as they were trying to get these new coaches in and get them exposure to the media. All right. We are now done with this segment. When we come back, we'll finish up a little bit on that. We're also going to ask some of those questions heading into camp that we have as camp gets underway this week, of course, in Henderson. It started yesterday and will continue to roll on and get more significant as the week goes on. And that is around everything from chemistry to the McDaniels offense to grasping the defense to how will the running back room shake out. So don't go anywhere. When Mo and I come back, we're going to talk through all those issues and any of the other news up on the board. Do us a favor. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast wherever you get it, whether you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, on the Odyssey app, wherever you get it. Do us a favor. Go subscribe. Give us a 5-star rating. We'd appreciate that as well. Also, a quick shout out. If you want to watch us, especially Mo got this killer new camera, so you could see him even better now. Check us out on YouTube. You can follow us on youtube.com/silverblack today. We'll step aside. We'll come back and we talk more Raiders football here on Silver and Black Today, an Odyssey original podcast.